Okay, I think we'll get started. We're running about 5 minutes late, so I will take 5 more minutes at the end of mine to make sure we get all of it in. My topic this morning is the costs of inflation, and I think this is I hope anyway, it's a pretty timely topic given that the fears of inflation are out there. If you recall back to where we started on Monday evening, in Larry's PowerPoint that evening, he had that scary graph of the monetary base growing by, from about 800 billion to 2.234 trillion. In particular, the growth in excess reserves from very little to like that hockey stick graph going almost straight vertical. So one of the concerns people have at the moment is that in the Fed's attempt to combat the crisis, it has laid the groundwork for a potential significant inflation out the other end. As we were discussing the other night, does the Fed have an exit strategy? Can it defuse the bomb, in the right way? Meanwhile, the bomb keeps ticking. What's interesting also, of course, is that there's been talk in the media the last month or so about fears of deflation. And so it's a strange world where we have this sort of increase in the monetary base and excess reserves that has not translated into actual spending and increase in the price level, mainly because, again, for the reasons we talked about Monday night, it's sitting there in bank reserves. These other graphs was the M2 divided by the monetary base, and what's happened there, that one falls off a cliff, right? Because the base has gone up, but the money multiplier has taken a dive, and all those reserves are just, again, sitting in the banks for a variety of reasons we talked about. But with all that said, in a world where we're running deficits of over $1 trillion a year, where we have $13 trillion in accumulated debt, and we've done all these things, the Fed's done all these things it's done to try to combat the crisis that have increased, more than doubled its balance sheet. Talking about inflation seems to be a very timely topic, even if we haven't seen it manifest itself yet in the American economy. In particular, what I want to do today, and this is based on a paper of mine from 2003 or 4, something like that, called The Costs of Inflation Revisited, which is a sort of extension of one of the chapters in my Routledge book, which is now available in paperback from Amazon.com. And what I want to do is to contrast the sort of standard view of inflation that economists have taken for many years, a sort of neoclassical standard view, and then contrast that with what Austrians might say. So just to introduce it, right, the sort of standard view of the cost of inflation, aside one of the things that's raised is it's a tax on money holding, right? That the value of money decreases thanks to inflation, and that imposes a couple other costs on people. What were historically known as shoe leather and menu costs, and these have gotten kind of quaint, right, in the 21st century. But let me briefly explain what they're after. The idea of shoe leather costs was, well, look, if you have inflation, you have to more frequently replenish your nominal money holdings, right? Prices are going up. You keep spending the cash you have on hand. That means you got to keep replenishing your cash holdings. And so at a time when people use cash, and before the ATMs that Larry was just talking about, the argument was, well, let's say you lived in Toronto and you had to go to the bank all the time. You'd have to walk up and down Yonge Street and you'd wear down your shoe leather. Canadian reference number 1 for my Canadian friends. You'd wear down the leather in your shoes, and the argument was you'd have to get your shoes resoled or buy new shoes more often. Now, okay, that's a kind of quaint example all around for a number of reasons. But what it does point out is that there are transaction costs involved in keeping up with cash, keeping your cash balances in the face of inflation. And as I'll mention later, I don't think this is a zero, of no importance. But the question is, how important is it? Menu costs, of course, similar. similar idea, which is in the face of inflation, the sellers of goods and services have to continually remark their menus, have to continually reprice their products. So if you go into Tim Hortons to get coffee and donuts, they have to continually update their prices in the face of inflation. That's 2 Canadian references in the first 5 minutes. So those guys owe me a present now. That's all I've been told. See you after. Okay. Now we got that out of the way. Because Larry got one in, right? He had the Canada thing. They all plot, so I got to get one. All right. So this is the standard view, that there's these shoe leather and menu costs, these costs of changing prices, the cost of keeping up your cash balances. And what I'm going to argue in general is that this perspective does not take market process and monetary institutions seriously enough. It doesn't take the way in which money affects the economy, and you'll see I'm going to build off some of the insights from my earlier lecture, and it doesn't take monetary institutions seriously enough. And I would add to that, it also doesn't think enough about sort of the broader political economy of inflation. And so what I'm hoping to do this morning is to sort of walk you through a whole series of steps by which we can see what I would argue, the real costs of inflation are. And each of these, I'm going to start fairly narrow in terms of economic costs and keep building the story more broadly, and we'll end up with some sort of very larger kind of political economy questions at the end. So that's the game plan. I think the most important thing that Austrians point out about inflation is this idea of the importance of the process by which inflation takes place and the importance of relative price effects. Okay? And the argument here is simple, right? That relative price effects, that is changes in the prices of different goods compared to, one compared to each other, are inherent to monetary expansion. It's inherent to inflation. That when you have an excess supply of money, when the central bank decides to increase the money supply, that the way in which that money enters into the system has to be through particular times and particular places. That money gets in the hands of some people first. They will spend that on some goods and services. Others don't have it. They can't spend it, right? And the goods and services that the first folks spend it on, those will rise in price first. Other goods and services will rise in price later. Moreover, there's no way to predict exactly which way this money will sort of flow through the system. And so even after the, say, a one-time inflation is over, there's no reason to expect that every price will rise by an equal amount. Suppose the Fed creates, 10% more money, right? 10% increase in the money supply. We know from the quantity equation that we should expect the price level on average to increase by 10%, assuming no change in velocity or any of that, right? So we'd expect a 10% increase in the price level. But as I pointed out last time, the price level is a construct. What it is a construct of are all those millions and millions of individual prices. And because inflation doesn't take place through this sort of smooth helicopter drop or through the angel Gabriel tapping everyone on the head, right, and magically increasing our money supply, our money holdings by 10% in our bank accounts and our wallets, because it happens at specific times and specific places, right, those the individual prices, some will move up by more than 10%, some by less, and you'll get this, again, what I referred to last time, as the price revolution here, as prices change in these ways. And so the important thing is that these are not about people making interpretive errors, about guessing wrong about whether it's due to whether the changes in demand for the products are due to inflation or not. And if only people knew it was about inflation, we'd get this smooth, neutral inflation. That's not it. It's also not. There's another literature, mainstream literature, that argues these relative price effects are a result of those menu costs. That some people change their prices first, other people change them later, and the result is we get these differentials in prices. That might be true. Okay, but that's not the fundamental point. The fundamental point here is that relative price effects, the fact that some goods go up by a lot and some not as much, is inherent in the very institutional process by which inflation takes place. It's not something that you can avoid completely, that you can avoid at all under central banking. So that's a key point here, that these relative price effects are there. If you want to sort of add another point to this, right, you can make a kind of public choice argument too. Dick Wagner did this in a paper, I want to say in 1980, and it's a clever argument, basically arguing that, look, if there's a connection between inflation and budget deficits, that one of the reasons we see inflation is a result of deficit spending, well, we know that deficit spending tends to be targeted towards folks who will provide votes, right? So why would we not imagine that that to the degree that in turn generates inflation, that there's a relationship between the relative price effects we see from inflation and the particular place that spending is targeted, right, that way. I mean, as Wagner puts it, why would politicians, no politician would want to create a neutral increase in the money supply when they could, I'm paraphrasing, in essence buy votes by trying to direct that increase in the money supply, or at least the underlying causes of it, in ways that appeal to the marginal voter, right? That appeal to those most likely to support them. So we can make another argument here that basically says, look, we can imagine relative price effects happening for these kinds of public choice reasons. And again, the price level here is not what matters to people. What matters are these individual prices. When entrepreneurs are engaging in monetary calculation, trying to determine what they should do next, they're not saying, well, what's the price level today? They're saying, what's the prices of the specific inputs I might use for alternative production process? What is the expected price I think I can get for my product? And making those comparisons. And so these changes in relative prices that happen through the inflation process, those are the ones that matter for what is ultimately the coordination process we care about at the microeconomic level. And you can see how this relates back to some things I talked about in the first lecture, that ultimately what we care about here is microeconomic coordination, entrepreneurship, monetary calculation. Another way to see this point about relative price effects, and another sort of comparison to the way that many mainstream economists do this, is that again, they have in the last 20, 25 years begun to talk about the idea of relative price effects. The notion that, okay, maybe some prices get out of alignment with each other during inflation. But normally what this argument is that these relative price effects take us away from the equilibrium array of prices, right? That the problem with relative price effects, goes the standard view, is that we get this period, again, where say one person has changed their menu cost before, or changed their prices before another person has, another firm has, and that, because one's changed and one hasn't, we're thrown out of what would otherwise be the general equilibrium array of prices. And there's this literature that tries to sort of measure the impact of relative price effects by trying to say, well, just how far out of equilibrium are we thrown, and how long does it take us to sort of recover from that, and how long will it take everyone to make those menu adjustments, those price adjustments, so we're back in equilibrium. And again, I think this goes back to some things we were talking about earlier in the week, this sort of whole question with how we understand the point that Hayek raised in Use of Knowledge in Society about the epistemic role of prices. Again, in the mainstream view, what is that what Hayek was saying was that equilibrium prices are fully informative. That's the reading we get. That's right. That's the neoclassical reading of Hayek. And I don't think that's what Hayek was saying. I think he was making a more subtle argument about the way in which disequilibrium prices are still conveyors of information, are surrogates for knowledge, and allow us to coordinate our economic behavior. And so that's why I think in the Austrian perspective, the problem with relative price effects is not that they drive us farther away from equilibrium, although in some sense that might be true, but more generally that they undermine this epistemic, this knowledge function of prices. Right? That when you have these relative price effects that are changing the value of one good in comparison to another, as a result, not because people have, the good's more scarce or people value it more, but simply because of inflation, you've made those prices less reliable guides to calculation and production and all of these sorts of things. And we can distinguish, and this is in a piece of Pete's, I actually think it's in his first book, has a nice discussion of the different sort of knowledge functions of prices here, sort of distinguishing among the ex ante, ex post, and discovery functions of prices. That is, prices tell us before the fact, guide entrepreneurs before the fact about what they might produce and how they might produce it. Right? I want to make shoes. I want to make dress shoes. What input should I use to make it? I look at prices, right, before I decide on my production process. I engage in budgeting. I try to calculate what will be the most profitable course of action. Then I engage in production. And after the fact, ex post, I can look at those prices, calculate profit and loss, decide whether or not what I had done was the right way of doing things, and then maybe decide again, what would be a better set of inputs into my production of dress shoes. The discovery function of prices, of course, this is associated most with Hayek and certainly Kerzner as well, right? Says prices play a role in spurring us to imagine alternatives that we haven't already thought of. I'm sort of saying, I'm going to make dress shoes. How am I going to do that? Did I do it well? Right? But in looking at the array of prices, I might notice an opportunity to engage in something very different, whether it's make running shoes instead of dress shoes or make something altogether different. And to the degree that prices track the underlying variables of people's preferences, of physical scarcity, all these sorts of things, technology, we can rely on these to do the best job that they can to inform those decisions. What inflation does, however, is to undermine this role, is to, again, to use Hayek's sort of words, to throw noise into the system here, to make the signaling function of prices more difficult for us to interpret what the real signal is out of the noise of inflation. And the result of that is that this begins again to have these effects at the microeconomic level, undermining entrepreneurship and economic calculation and making it difficult for entrepreneurs to produce the things that people want and for us to have whatever, however we define economic coordination and growth and so forth, making those less likely, more difficult for entrepreneurs to do their job. So relative price effects here, what Austrians are arguing is, yeah, I mean, relative price effects are really important, but it's not just because they drive us away from some preset equilibrium, although that may be true. It's a broader point about the way in which these make prices and markets less reliable as processes for generating economic discovery, for economic calculation, for all the things that we think markets are valuable for. And this point about relative price effects and how inflation undermines the price system, I think is the fundamental insight behind the rest of the discussion this morning. Once you see that point, a lot of interesting things follow from it, and this whole broader way of seeing the cost of inflation follow. So I think that's the key point here, to see the way in which those relative price effects take place. So what I want to do with the rest of the time, again, is, as I said earlier, is to start sort of slowly expanding this notion, or these notions of the cost of inflation from this starting point. And to see this, one of the points I want to make off the top is that what I'm going to engage in is a kind of comparative institutions view of the costs of inflation. And what I mean by that is, if we want to understand what the costs of inflation are, we need to take the view that we have to get at those costs by comparing what an economy with inflation looks like and what one without inflation looks like. That's the comparison we want to make. That's this kind of comparative institutions view. To see that, the reason why that's important is we don't want to just stop by saying, well, okay, what do people do when inflation happens, right? We want to say, how is their behavior different under inflation than it would be if there were no inflation, and to begin to understand what some of the problems there are. So I'm going to talk about, I think, 5 items here that sort of, again, take us from the narrow to the broad. The first point I want to make, and this is a kind of this is a good example of this sort of comparative institutions view. I'm not going to say too much about it, but I want to mention it now. And that's the sort of GDP and the cost of inflation. This is an old argument, right? This is a kind of broken window fallacy type argument, but it's worth repeating here. If economists were going to go out, some economists are going to go out and look for the cost of inflation. One thing it might be tempting to do is to say, well, let's look at the relationship between inflation and GDP. If inflation really is bad and costly and socially costly, right, wouldn't it presumably affect GDP? Wouldn't it drive down GDP per capita, however one wants to gauge it? Well, the problem with this argument is that it turns out that a number of the costs of inflation are things that not only won't show up in GDP, but actually add or count as part of GDP. Right? In the same way that if you hear the bad argument, right, that well, at least the good thing about Hurricane Katrina is, we spent all those resources rebuilding New Orleans, right? All those count in GDP. If you look to sort of measure the Louisiana GDP, it would look pretty good, right? But I don't think we want to say that's a good thing economically. Same with the riots in LA. Same with with any of these kinds of disasters. It's a version of the sort of broken window fallacy, right? Same is true here. And what I'm going to argue in a couple minutes is that one of the big costs of inflation is that it imposes coping costs on us. That is, that when inflation happens, we start to expend resources to guard against, to cope with inflation. All the resources we expend doing that are things that count in GDP. Right? The same way that rebuilding after a natural disaster counts in GDP, or fixing the broken window counts in GDP. So looking at GDP as our sort of gauge of the cost of inflation is going to not be very helpful, because many of those costs, in fact, lead to are activities that count towards GDP. The question we want to ask is the comparative one. What would things look like if we didn't have inflation? What would those resources we devote to fighting inflation be doing if we didn't have inflation, right? Which is the broken window fallacy. What would the owner of the shop, right, do with the money he spends fixing the broken window if the window had never been broken? Buying a suit, right? And then we go from there. So that's the comparative perspective. And so I'm going to talk really about 4 categories of things. I want to talk a little bit about the way in which inflation leads to the misallocation of capital, and this is, again, a particularly Austrian point, I think. I'm going to spend some time talking about this coping cost point in a bit more detail, because there's a few things we might talk about there. Then I want to broaden out and sort of talk a little bit about the way in which the inflation, by undermining the price system, begins to affect the way people think about markets and politics as alternative resource allocation mechanisms. And then finally, to the really big question is the ways in which inflation can, in fact, sort of undermine social order, economic order in a much broader sense. So that's where we're going to go in the rest of the time. So costs of misallocated capital. A lot of the inflation literature talks about the idea of signal extraction problems, right? The idea that we have to decide whether the change in prices or whether the activity we're seeing happen is a result of real changes in the underlying variables or the result of inflation. And so there are, for Austrians, that's, again, as I've suggested already, right, this is a key issue. This can be a key issue, something we really do want to talk about, right? The idea that entrepreneurs have to try to figure out whether or not the price changes they're seeing are real or inflationary. But it's a little bit more than that, right? In the mainstream literature, the focus is on, well, is it real, is it monetary? But also for Austrians, there's part of that question is determining what the path that money has, sort of figuring out, am I in the path of that inflation, right? Is it the case that my particular increase in prices, not just, again, the kind of a general scaling up, but when you take those relative price effects seriously, it's about where did this inflation go to, and am I in the path of it? And the analogy I like to use, or the heuristic I like to use here, is imagine, oversimplifying dramatically, that when the Fed decides to inflate, it does so by printing up more Federal Reserve notes, except the inflationary ones, the additions to the money supply, are blue instead of green. And so imagine we were looking like an echocardiogram, or what do you call it when you put the dye in, right? I'm getting old, I don't remember these words, right? When you sort of look at the flow of your blood by dyeing it or something, so you can see whatever it's called. That's the analogy I'm after here, right? We could sort of from above kind of watch where those blue dollars go. And who do they affect and how do they affect it? And the challenge for entrepreneurs is to know, am I being affected by the inflationary spending, or am I just being affected by, again, people really changing their wants? Where am I sitting in that path? The problem, of course, is there's no way for entrepreneurs to know that, because the dollars aren't blue and we can't see them, and all the entrepreneur sees is a change in price, a change in demand for their product, or a change in the price of alternative inputs, right? And has to make an interpretive decision about whether this is inflationary or not. So I think when we think in terms of this, the relative price effect story that Austrians tell and the Cantillon effect story, that this adds a layer of complexity to this signal extraction problem. But it's worse than that, because when we begin to think carefully about derived demand and capital allocation, one of the real problems facing the entrepreneur is deciding whether this change is an inflationary one or not, is also deciding whether they think this change is temporary or permanent, because there's costs to getting that decision wrong. So for example, if the entrepreneur says, well, okay, I'm seeing greater demand for my products, kind of pushing prices up, I need to produce more, right? And they might say, well, I'll just run the machine a little faster, I'll hire a few more workers. But they also might say, you know what, it seems to be sticking around. Maybe I need a new factory, maybe I need to purchase more machinery, right? Whatever it might be. And when they begin to make those decisions about acquiring new capital, then the dangers come in. Why? Because we know from Austrian capital theory that capital goods are not homogeneous. It's not a lump of Play-Doh, of putty that we can shape the way we want. that capital goods are multiply specific. And so if the entrepreneur decides in the face of inflation to go ahead and acquire new capital, and it turns out they were wrong, it turns out the effects were just temporary, then you're stuck with this piece of capital that may not, that for you no longer serves the purpose you hoped for, and may not have an easy purpose for someone else to fulfill. So what we have here is the fact that the costs of refitting capital are irretrievable. If you're stuck with this capital good you bought and you don't have the need for it that you thought you would have, either you're going to have to sell it at a loss, or you're going to have to expend costs in refitting it and retooling it to make it perhaps do something different, right? And all of those costs associated with the specificity of capital, are part of the cost of inflation, right? Those are losses. You bought something, it's not going to create the value you thought it was going to create. That reflects a real loss. And again, this is related to, when Austrians talk about capital, we talk about complementarity and substitutability, right? The idea that capital goods for the entrepreneur, and sort of entrepreneur's static perception of the production plan, capital goods have to be complementary. They have to fit together. My labor, my machinery, my other kinds of physical capital all have to fit together to sort of make this consistent plan. And faced with a change that forces me to rethink that plan, now I need to make substitutions. Now I need to do something different. And the problem here is that if you guess wrong about the signal, you're going to be led to engage. You're going to expend resources that you cannot completely recover. Again, if it turns out that you are wrong. And one of the important points here is this is one reason why money is not neutral for Austrians, even in the long run. Right? The mainstream literature says, oh, okay, well maybe money has these non-neutral, relative price type effects in the short run, but in the long run, right, money's neutral. But if you take this capital argument seriously, it can't be neutral in the long run, because to the degree that inflation induces people to spend on these capital goods that turn out to be wrong and who can't be costlessly refit, you've wasted resources, you've expended resources that you can't get back. That, in turn, is going to affect the prices of those goods, and you're going to be stuck with a capital structure that, again, if there hadn't been inflation in the first place, would have looked very different. The inflation-induced capital structure is, in that sense, inefficient compared to what would have been otherwise. Right? And capital, you can't just, again, it's not Plato, right? You can't just restructure that capital the way you want it. You're stuck with it. It's a historical artifact. And to the degree it embodies those inflation-generated mistakes, you're going to have real effects on real output, real growth in the long run. So this is a sort of combination of the relative price effects point and an understanding of how Austrians think about capital get us to this. What's interesting about this is that this point, I think, is just completely absent from the mainstream literature on inflation. And one of the reasons is assumptions that are made about the supply side. This is a piece by Horwitz, V. Horwitz, on these issues of the cost of inflation. And he says at one point, in the long run, relative prices are fixed because of perfect substitutability on the supply side. Right? That's the quote, right? So the idea here is, well, look, no matter what entrepreneurs do, they can always engage in this kind of substitution on the supply side and develop new, just capital's Play-Doh, right? Can just easily, perfectly, costlessly substitute different inputs for other inputs and respond to whatever price signals are saying. If you make that assumption, well, sure, you can't see the way in which money is not going to be neutral in the long run, precisely because you're ignoring the imperfect substitutability of capital goods. You're ignoring that heterogeneity and that specificity. And I think that's a key point. Again, I think we maybe said a couple times during the week, but I really do think that at the core of many of the differences between Austrians and neoclassical mainstream economists has to do with our understanding of capital. I think that was at the core of the calculation debate. It was at the core of the Hayek-Keynes debate. And it continues to be, I think, how Austrians think about the stimulus and recovery today. Almost all of it, at some level, comes down to that understanding of capital. The idea of heterogeneity and capital as a structure. One little note I'll add here is I think this applies to human capital too, right? And if you don't believe, well, unemployment just came out this morning, 9.5%, right? So it didn't go up, but it's not good. And one of the things we're seeing is, where's the unemployment, right? The unemployment is in those professions in which the demand, where that sort of derived demand for labor was induced by the areas that were booming. So we see unemployed construction workers, we see still people unemployed in the financial industry, okay? And it's all the areas in which rode the boom where people said, wow, it's a great time to get into real estate. Wow, look how good those construction jobs are, right? Seeing the increasing wages and the increasing demand and misreading the signal, investing in their human capital in particular sorts of ways, only to find now that that was a false signal. It took a little while, but when the reality was revealed, they discovered that the skills they acquired were actually not in demand in the way they thought, at least not in a sustainable way. Okay, and I should footnote, you need to use that word, reclaim that word sustainability. It's interesting that it's been, the sort of environmentalists talk all the time about sustainability, right? Well, we should be too, right? I mean, what's the boom? As Roger has said, right? The boom is just unsustainable growth. We should be using that word too. So all those investments in human capital weren't ultimately sustainable. And now you have people who are realizing it's not costless. There's not perfect substitutability on the supply side, right? That it's not costless to go from a construction worker to wherever the demand is going to be now. And again, the sort of rigidities in the labor market, including the extension of unemployment benefits and these sorts of things, have prevented us from discovering what those alternatives might be. So I think this applies to human capital as well. And I think you can see how this ties in with Roger's talks on Austrian cycle theory, right? That this is just another, it's kind of looking at the same process from a little bit different angle, that what we see in Austrian cycle theory is a particular form in which this malinvestment in the early stages of production and so forth lead to the same sort of problem of having created capital goods that no longer have value. You drive around the areas that were most affected by the housing boom and you see these empty buildings, empty houses and empty office buildings, right? You can't just costlessly turn those into something else. So these are all effects, all costs of inflation. All of these things that happen impose costs on people, involve waste, involve losses that simply would not exist if we did not have the inflation. Okay. So that's the capital, misallocated capital story. Let me talk a little bit about coping costs. Because this is where this comparative perspective particularly becomes important. And I want to start by sort of making an analogy argument that there's a sense in which coping costs are analogous to the waste we associate with rent seeking. Okay, and when Tulloch wrote the '67 paper, it was the cost of tariffs, monopoly, and theft, right? So he had three examples there where the welfare cost of tariff, monopoly, and theft. And the idea here is that when we think about rent-seeking literature, the fact that government has a privilege that it's going to dispense leads people to expend resources to acquire that privilege that we can see as wasteful by saying, what if government never did that in the first place? If government's offering a monopoly over the production of beer, let's say, that would be, first of all, horrible. But let's suppose, okay, you can imagine what that beer would taste like. Government's going to have a monopoly over the production of beer, and everyone starts, spending lots of resources lobbying to become the one firm that wins the contract to be the monopoly producer of beer. Okay. All those expenditures, right, on the Tulloch's argument, the costs of that beer monopoly are not just the deadweight loss triangle that we normally talk about, but also that additional rectangle of all the resources people spend trying to acquire the monopoly. The coping costs of inflation are very similar, right? It's the kinds of expenditures people take to protect themselves that they wouldn't have to undertake if there were no inflation. It's perhaps easiest to see actually with the third of Tulloch's examples, which is theft. And here's my favorite example of this. How many of you watch Seinfeld? Just quick show of hands. Okay, enough to make this work. Even the Canadians watch Seinfeld. Okay. Visualize Jerry's apartment for a second, right? And visualize the door to Jerry's apartment. Now, your first thing, Kramer's not flying in the door, okay? But visualize the door. What do you notice about that door? What's on that door? Remember? No, not a coat rack. No, what's?
Oh, the peephole.
Yeah, there's a peephole. What else is on the door? There's at least two, right? And what's the other thing he's got just next to the door?
Buzzer.
A buzzer, yeah, speaker. Yeah, George, come on up. Okay, yeah. So he's got a buzzer and a bunch of deadbolts and a peephole. Maybe a doorman too, if you know that episode of Seinfeld. Okay. So he's got all this security. Why? Well, he lives in Manhattan. Why? Well, Manhattan is a high crime area. So if you live in a high crime area, one of the coping costs of crime will be the fact that you expend all these resources protecting yourself against crime. Okay? I live in a 7,000 person town in the St. Lawrence Valley of New York. There is no door, I think, anywhere in Canton, New York that looks like Seinfeld's door. In fact, my first house that we owned did not even have a deadbolt. It had a little key lock on the door. Okay? The one sound that you almost never hear in Canton, New York is the sound of a car alarm going off. Why? First of all, car theft is almost zero. Second of all, if you knew this, could see the cars people drive, you'd know people want to steal them anyway. Okay? But there's almost never. In fact, when a car alarm goes off, it's a pretty good bet it belongs to a student, not to one of the people that actually live in the town. Why? Because there's no crime. There's near zero crime. We've almost never locked all of our doors at night. See, now I can say that, but if you really want to make the trip up and rob my house, go right ahead. I can say that in a room full of mostly libertarians, right? Because I trust you. You respect property rights. All these kinds of things. But we don't lock the door. I mean, there's people who live there for 30 years, go on vacation for a week, don't lock their door. Right? So it's a very different, when the crime rate's low. And notice, by the way, it's not about the actual rate, it's about the expected rate. Right? So if you expect crime, even if it doesn't happen, if you expect there to be a lot of crime, you'll invest in the resources to protect yourself. If you expect there to be significant inflation, you may well begin to invest in the resources to protect yourself. The point I want to make is that so from a comparative institutions question, all of these coping costs are wasteful. Why? Because if there weren't inflation, take Seinfeld, if there weren't crime in Manhattan, or crime was much lower, expected crime was much lower, the resources devoted to engaging in that security protection, in this case, the people who own the apartment building, right, could be devoted to directly satisfying wants, to a nice TV, to spiffing up the apartment building in other ways, whatever it might be, right? If you own a house and you put a security system in, the money you spend in that security system, you could be spending on something else if crime were lower. So it's analogous in that sense to these rent-seeking rates. And the point is, and I'm going to come back to this at the end, given the crime rate or the expected crime rate, it's not stupid to protect yourself. Right? I mean, it's not a stupid thing. I mean, in fact, you'd be stupid not to protect yourself. So it's not that we're saying, well, people are stupid in making these decisions. They're not. They're very smart. The regime, as it were, the fact that you're living with the expectation of crime or living with the expectation of inflation creates a situation in which the smart thing to do is to engage in these expenditures, which you wouldn't have to engage in if the inflation or the crime weren't there in the first place. That's this notion of coping costs, and that's the sense in which they're wasteful in this comparative sense. So what do we mean by coping costs? Well, we mentioned a couple already, right? Just for fun, just to say it again, walking up and down Yonge Street to the bank, right? Scotiabank or something maybe, okay? And then, Tim Hortons having to change their menu more often, okay? Those are coping costs. And by the way, if you guys, most of you in this room are too young to remember this, but in the days before computerized prices, now when the grocery store, say, wants to change the prices, right, just goes in and enters it. But during the 1970s, before computerized prices, you'd go into the grocery store and you'd pick up, this is, remember when inflation was banned, you'd pick up a can of tuna, right? And what would you see in the can of tuna? Like 4 price tags kind of stamped over each other, right? Because the prices were rising so quickly that they'd have to hire, workers to go with the little sticker gun, right, and restamp the prices all the time. Now you can just change it, or if they have the shelf tags, you can just put a new shelf tag on. So that's one. I mean, that's sort of one notion of menu costs. When we first moved to Canton, there was a restaurant in the next town over. This was like in the late 80s. Had its menu was like on laminated plastic, right? And they would just like magic marker the prices on. And I think that's maybe a holdover from a time when prices were changing a little more rapidly, and you literally didn't want to have to print up new menus. It's cheaper now, right, with low-cost computer printing and all these sorts of things. So the point is, these things aren't, they're not zero. But if this is all there was to inflation, why would we worry so much about it? Right? One of the strange things about inflation, by the way, most of the time what economists do is argue that the public's sort of, innocent, naive, lay understanding of economics is wrong. Right? Brian Kaplan's book, for example, right, is all about this. But inflation is one of the interesting exceptions, I think. The public is much more fearful about inflation than the experts are. Right? Economists tend not to worry as much about inflation as I think the average person does. And it's interesting why that difference is there, and we can ponder that question. So shoe leather and menu costs are examples of these coping costs. Another example is contract negotiation and enforcement. Right? In a world where inflation exists or is expected, parties to contracts, you can think about labor contracts here, have to continually and carefully negotiate how that contract's going to work. Are we going to have a cost of living clause adjustment? How much is it going to be? Is it going to be for last year? Is it going to be forward-looking? And even in other kinds of contracts, we need to make sure that we enforce those clauses, that we come up with some way of coping with the fact that prices are going to rise or expected to rise over the term of that contract. And so this imposes on parties to the contract the need to spend more time working out those details. It's jobs for lawyers, it's jobs for economists, right? All these sorts of things come about because inflation makes this process more complicated than it would be otherwise. Similarly, we can talk about accountancy issues. One of the problems with inflation is how do you try to account for it when you figure profit and loss? Take this simple example. If I buy a bunch of inputs on January 1st, it costs me $100, and on December 31st, I bring those inputs together, including the labor and everything. I produce a product that I sell at the end of the year for $200. Okay, it looks like, well, I bought them the inputs for $100, sold it for $200. We'll ignore interest for the moment, right? It looks like I made a $100 profit. But what if the inflation rate was 50% during that year? Right? Some portion of that $100 profit reflects not an increase in real value, but the fact that the ruler that we use to measure value has changed. Right? The way to think about that is when we compare value through time in terms of money, we're assuming we're comparing those things with a ruler, right? And anytime we use a ruler, if I say, what's the length and width here, and compare and say, well, this is longer than this, the tacit assumption I'm making if I use a ruler to do that is that in between measuring this and this, the distance between the inch marks on the ruler hasn't changed, right? Well, I assume it's the same ruler both times. But what if I measured this, and then before I measured this, right, all the inch marks kind of crowded together, okay? And so that what was a foot before now shows 15 inches. Right? Ooh, these must be the same length. Well, no, my ruler changed. Right? The markings on my ruler, my way of gauging it changed. And so inflation is like that changing ruler, right? That when you compare prices through time, you're measuring with two different things, right? When the value of money changes. And so this poses problems for accountants, right? For how do we determine what portion of those profits or losses are due to inflation, what are due to real changes in the value of the good? Now your temptation might be to say, well, why not just make the price level adjustment? Say, okay, well, we know inflation went up. You know, the money supply increased by 10%. We know the price level will increase by 10%, so why not just knock 10% off the final price and say that's your adjustment? Problem there? What's the problem? Yeah, relative price effects. You don't know whether you were hit by the blue dollar disease or not, right? You don't know whether you were, how much in the path of that inflation you were. It could be that you were particularly in the path in a way that in fact that increase in value represents not the underlying variables, but it just so happened that people who came into the additional funds were buying more of your product or less of your input or whatever it was than other things. So it could be that you were particularly hit by the inflation. Might be, might not. It turns out, right, that your best guess may well be to take the average, but just because it's your best guess doesn't mean it's going to be right. Okay, and so accountants have no perfect way of adjusting for under inflation, adjusting how they calculate profit and loss. And that means entrepreneurs have to make their best guess looking at those profit and loss statements about what does it mean. So entrepreneurs now have to engage in this additional sort of complexity of interpretation and so forth. And that makes their job that much harder. These might be the most obvious sort of coping costs, right? What we might call producer and consumer asset protection. Both firms and households want to protect their assets against the losses that inflation will impose upon them. Right? One of the things we see happen in inflation-ridden economies, by the way, is a shift from production to finance. That the financial sector of the economy in relative terms gets larger because Oftentimes, the inflation itself is generating more loans and more financial business, but also people are seeing the effects of the inflation and trying to protect themselves against it, or perhaps ride it and win it, right? If you think about the housing boom, we created lots of jobs in finance. The whole mess of derivatives and all that stuff that was created on the top of the housing bubble, right, all reflect this cost of inflation, as it turns out. And consumers too, right? Households want to protect themselves, right? If you're in an inflation-ridden economy, you might want to hire a financial advisor to help protect you against that inflation. At least on the margin, you're more likely to do that with inflation than you are in an economy absent of inflation. Notice, of course, that all of this activity counts in GDP. If I spend money on a financial advisor instead of buying a new LCD TV, counts in GDP. But like the broken window, I'm worse off compared to what I would have been had there been no inflation in the first place. I'd have the LCD TV, and I wouldn't have the inflation to worry about as well. So one of the big coping costs here, I think in many ways this might be the biggest, is the way in which inflation induces people to expend resources to protect their assets against inflation, and even expected inflation, in all these kinds of ways, and pushes resources into places where it otherwise would not go. And this is this point I was making before. While these expenditures are wasteful in the comparative institution sense, they're not irrational given the world that individuals live in, right? Given inflation, it makes perfect sense to protect yourself, even though all that expenditures on protection are wasteful compared to a world where there's no inflation. And I think that's a really, this is distinction. We're seeing this one a lot, right, in the discussions over the stimulus and all these sorts of things, and how people, the sort of coping kinds of strategies people make. Wasteful is always about this notion of comparative institutions. Something can still be a rational expenditure to protect yourself given the situation, even though it's wasteful in the larger picture. Costs. Let me talk about relative costs of markets and politics. Here, the question is simple, sort of which path to wealth, okay? It comes down to this. If I want to get wealthy, I got two choices, okay? I can build a better mousetrap, or I can walk to the back of the room with a baseball bat and club Peter over the head and take his wallet, okay? I'm going to get wealthy both ways, all right? The question is, the first way, however, I think, right, is better for society, though if you don't like Peter, maybe the second. But the second is negative sum, or at least zero sum at best. The first is positive sum. We want people to pursue wealth by creating the goods and services that other people want, right? The problem with inflation is that these scrambled price signals make it more likely on the margin that people are going to turn to the state, turn to the political process as their preferred way of increasing their wealth, of allocating resources. And this can happen in a whole bunch of different kinds of ways. Axel Leonhofer has a wonderful article called The Costs and Consequences of Inflation, which in many ways was inspiration for a number of things here. And Leonhofer talks about the way in which what happens during inflation is people can't, they see all these problems happening in the economy, but they can't connect those with the underlying cause. It just looks like these unrelated weird things that are happening. He got rich, how did he get so rich, and this and that, and so all these things happening, but they can't intellectually connect it to inflation. So what do they tend to do? Instead of saying to the government, stop the inflation, they say, tax him, put a quota on her, intervene here. And so it's this sort of, he uses, I think, the word babble. He says there's this babble toward the political process of people saying you need to intervene and fix all of these problems because markets aren't working very well, right, because of the inflation. The result of this is heaven for politicians, right? Because now they've got a babble and they can make some choices about which bits of the babble they want to address and the ones that have the largest political payoff to them. And the result of this is the intervention that happens on the, asked for frequently by the victims of inflation, creates new beneficiaries, right? That now you have people who are becoming the benefits of these programs initiated to fight inflation or fight the effects of inflation anyway. And now you've created a class of people who benefit from those government actions, who therefore are less likely to want to give it up than someone who isn't, or vote against it than someone who isn't. You can think of this as a kind of Coasean argument, right? The way that analogously, like Coase talks about whether or not people will use the structure of the firm or the market, right, to engage in exchange or to move resources, from place to place. And basically, the Coast 37 paper says, well, it just depends upon which one's more costly. What I'm arguing here is what inflation does is change the relative costs of markets and politics. And it makes, on the margin, it makes markets more expensive, as it were, to be the preferred resource allocation process, and therefore people who are on the margin more likely to ask the political process to intervene. And the result of this, of course, is two things we know and love, or know and hate, right? Is that we get the kind of interventionist dynamic problem that Mises identified, where once you begin to intervene, and those interventions, one, don't really solve the problems you hope they would solve, and two, create new problems that then become, people say, well, we've got a new problem, government, you need to step in and solve this. We get an additional intervention and so on. And so we can get out of inflation this sort of process by which the government's size grows, and it's the way in which it's intervening in markets grows in this kind of feeding on itself kind of way. And that can also, another way to look at that too, can be the Higgs ratchet effect, right? That what happens in an inflationary crisis, to use Higgs language, is that we see this growth of government that even if the inflation ends, we'll never go back to where we were before. The government might shrink afterwards, but it'll never return all the way to where it was before the inflation. This is one reason why, right? You've now got new beneficiaries who don't want to give up the programs that you've created to fight the inflation. So those two, I think, are two important, results that can happen, right, when inflation begins to undermine the marketplace. And again, the general point here is we see this overall movement away from markets as the primary resource allocation process. Inflation raises the cost of using the market. By messing up prices, by all the other things it does, it makes monetary calculation harder, it makes entrepreneurship more difficult to engage in, it makes all those functions of prices less reliable. All of those things undermine markets in this general sense. And notice, by the way, just kind of take a step back here for a minute, and notice how far we've come from shoe leather and menu costs, right? That we're asking questions about the way in which inflation doesn't just impose these fairly minor costs on us, but the way in which it undermines the very fundamental processes by which markets operate. And just to go one step farther, because we want to go all the way with this, right? That ultimately, and we've seen in hyperinflations how this can happen, that inflation poses a threat to the sort of whole fabric of the social order. And we've mentioned Mises' law of association. I think Peter Leeson's talk today will probably have a lot more to say about this. But the idea of that, what for Mises, exchange and monetary exchange and the division of labor and specialization and all these sorts of things were fundamental to how human beings cooperated, how they associated with each other, how they formed really the social civilization. And if you undermine money through inflation, you undermine the key institution necessary to generate the division of labor and specialization, exchange, and all the factors that go into enabling people to engage in peaceful social cooperation. For Mises and for others, exchange is this socializing process, right? What money does is it provides an easy way for us to cooperate. I don't always quote her in economics lectures, but there's the line in Atlas Shrugged, right, where Rand says something like, it's either guns, whips, and blood, or money. Take your choice, your time is running out, right? And what she means by that is that ultimately, people have two ways of dealing with each other. Through money and exchange and the social relationships it promotes, or through violence, through coercion, through guns, whips, and blood, or whatever the exact quote is. That's actually in the Francisco D'Anconia money speech in Atlas Shrugged. And yeah, she got it. Okay? Mises had a way of talking about this too. There's a very interesting discussion in Human Action about the difference between factual societies and hegemonic societies. That we can talk about societies being based on contract and exchange or on hegemony and power. Right? That if you don't have contracts and exchange, the alternative is the exercise of human beings engaging in power relationships with or over each other. And what I want to argue here is that to get this kind of society, you need money and you need a reliable, stable money, right? And inflation, at least in the extreme, can undermine that whole process and runs the danger of us ending up in this, again, this power-driven society. Inflation undermines exchange and contract, as the basis of social order, at least extreme inflation. I'm not suggesting that 2% inflation is going to lead to social collapse, kind of a Misesian road to serfdom, I guess, right? So that's not the argument, right? 2% inflation is going to cause problems, but if you keep it up, look, there's enough basket cases around the world to look at where extreme inflation has really caused these kinds of problems. And ultimately, and one of those examples was what Pete called him, the little guy with the mustache, right? That in Germany, one of the things that enabled Hitler to rise to power was the hyperinflation of the 20s, the post-World War I inflation. And the breakdown that caused created a kind of environment in which totalitarianism was not an unlikely, an impossible outcome. And when markets break down completely, when people perceive there's no rationality in their behavior in the marketplace, their increasing demands on the political process can create this possibility. And that totalitarianism can happen in two different ways. You don't have to have the little guy with the mustache. You can have lots of little guys and gals, I guess, in all kinds of suits in the big building in Washington, doing many of the same sorts of things. And so ultimately, when Lenin said there's no sure way of undermining capitalism than inflation, he was onto something. Right? We might disagree with his value judgment, but his analysis was onto something. And so the ultimate fear here is that if we don't find ways of controlling inflation, if we don't find ways of keeping inflation under constrained, and hopefully zero, all of the costs that I've talked about become increasing possibilities. And so just to follow up on Larry's last talk, if Larry and the work that Larry and George Selgin and myself and others have done on free banking, if we're right, okay, there's the connection, right? That the very fact that it is government control over banking, over the production of money, that makes inflation a problem, right? Bottom line, if you had $13 trillion in credit card debt and a printing press in your basement, what would you do? Right? And so when governments have control over the money supply and are heavily in debt, the temptation to inflation is real. And that's the world we're living in right now. And my concern is, again, going back to those graphs from the first night, it's out there sort of in the wings, under the porch, if you want to think about it, ticking under the bed, right? And if Bernanke and friends can't develop an exit strategy, right, we may be talking about these, not necessarily this stuff, but some of these costs of inflation may be very real and very present in the next few years, next decade. That's why I think it's really important to sort of understand in a more broad and complete sort of way exactly what the costs of inflation are. Because I really do think that economists, mainstream economists, though they haven't ignored it, have underestimated the real cost of inflation. And Austrians have a real value added here to sort of talk about why inflation is actually a lot worse than the mainstream economists think that it is. And I will end on that note, and we've got about 15, 20 minutes for questions. Yeah, Allison.
With the current disagreement with some people warning about deflation, some people warning about inflation, is that just a result of people applying different models to the policy environment, or is it because there's so much uncertainty with what the exit strategy is going to be, or something else going on?
I think it's more the latter. I think it's, there's two steps in the process, right? I think, maybe here's one way to put it. The people worrying about inflation are looking at the monetary base and the excess reserve spike and having a heart attack and going, oh my God, this is unprecedented, this is not, and it's reason for your heart to skip a beat, no question. But the deflationists are saying, but look at that other graph, M2, right, as a proportion of the base, and that we've actually, that all those reserves are just sitting there, not doing anything. And to the extent that we're in this kind of, malaise, where banks don't want to lend, where private investors don't want to invest, and from their perspective, where spending is too low, okay, they're saying, well, why are you worried about, it doesn't matter that all those reserves are out there. If people aren't spending, that's going to put downward pressure on prices. That's my take. I mean, I think you can ask maybe Larry or Roger at lunch if they see. Roger, does that make sense to you? Yeah. And so I think you sort of got people looking at two different, it's like the old joke, the blind guys and the elephant, right? They're grabbing different parts and seeing different parts of it. And it's a weird, it's a very unprecedented. We keep using that word. But to have all those excess reserves sitting out there doing nothing seems to me the only scenario in which the two economists can point to it. One says, inflation. The other says, well, deflation, right? So I think that's it. My worry, I mean, if the exit strategy isn't there, the worry is, and there's historical precedent for this, that if things pick up, you often in a recovery see a dramatic increase in velocity very quickly. You will see all those reserves, if rates start to rise, and the alternative for banks to the quarter point from the Fed is looking better out in the market, and they're convinced that the environment's more stable. I mean, it could turn on a dime, right? You could have those excess reserves bang, and you'd have inflation very quickly. And my own view is that's a much bigger worry than the sort of concern that we're not spending enough, and so, which is problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. So I'm still nervous. I mean, if Brian Kaplan style, I put my money where my mouth is and refinanced my mortgage a couple of months ago and got into a fixed rate because I just don't see how we're going to avoid that. I don't see the exit strategy depends on lots of cards falling the right way. Yeah.
How does sort of rational expectations, how does that play into this? Because you're talking about coping costs,
excellent.
there's a lot of expectations.
Yeah.
A lot of people are watching the monetary base now.
Sure.
So how do you think that the rational expectations of, hey, inflation could come back really quickly, how does that play into the story?
Well, I think that's a really good question on rational. How does rational expectations play into this? A couple of things, right? First, look, all the traditional rational expectation models are all about the sort of overall price level, right? So, I mean, one way when I teach this to students, I say, it's like what Lucas was saying is, look, if your phone rang and you picked up and said hi, and on the other end of the phone it was Ben Bernanke, and Ben said, Steve, I'm going to increase the money supply by 10% next year. Pass it on, right? You'd be an idiot, right, in the traditional model not to expect 10% inflation. I mean, if you look at the Friedman adaptive expectation, what that implicitly says is, well, thanks for that, Ben, but I don't really believe that because I've got this whole other couple years of weighted, whatever but okay, so and from an Austrian perspective, it would make sense to sort of watch it. But the problem is that even if you know what the aggregate is, you just don't know what the individual effects are. Even so, I think the rational expectations folks are on to something important, which is knowing what the monetary authority is doing is not an irrelevant piece of information. It's an important piece of information. I just don't think it enables you to completely neutralize the effects of monetary policy. Because again, you've got the blue dollars problem, right? You can't know exactly where this is going to go, and you can't predict the individual effects. If you could predict, I mean, being able to predict those individual effects is the equivalent of being the central planner, right? I mean, the whole reason we have a price system is that we rely on prices to do that. We don't know the underlying variables. And it may still be, like I said, that your best guess about inflation, the best adjustment you can make is to assume the average, right? If Helicopter Ben says it's going up by 10, it's going up by 10, even though your results may vary, but that the average is still your best guess, even if it's going to be wrong most of the time. So that said, the other problem with rational expectations, models at least, is that they're all built on Walrasian micro foundations. I mean, they're about maximization. There isn't that scope for discovery. They're basically saying, how do we explain macroeconomic outcomes as general equilibrium outcomes? And that's not a place where Austrians want to go. But that doesn't mean we should ignore whatever the Fed says it's doing. Yeah.
I first got someone to argue that we shouldn't be worried about inflation because the tip spread is predicting small. Is that a good indicator?
The tip spread is this. I think it's the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland developed this as an inflation predicting tool, and it takes input from a whole bunch of different places. And right now, the tips spread, which is a gauge of inflation expectations, is like 1%, right? And that's the average expected inflation that people have. And I don't think that's irrelevant, right? I mean, it does say that the experts aren't expecting inflation. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean they've got so much confidence in Bernanke's exit strategy, which that they think it'll work? Does it mean that they are just concerned about aggregate demand? I'm not sure exactly what that means. It may be that they're under-expecting, they're too heavily discounting, whatever way to look at it, that kind of flat, that quick increase in velocity that can happen when the economy turns around? I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know how you can that heavily discount the possibility of inflation when you're faced with the hockey stick graph. Another explanation might be, well, look at all that excess capacity out there. So even if that money got into the spending stream, it wouldn't drive prices up. Notice something there. Is that a Plato capital assumption in place, right? To say there's excess capacity doesn't mean it's the things that people will want when the spending kicks in. What are you going to do with all those houses and this and that, right? And same with labor. Yeah, you have lots of idle labor out there, but is it the labor entrepreneurs would want if things kick back in? And there does seem to be this assumption that when things kick back in, oh, well, we've just got all this labor and capital glob out there that we can just pull in to the production processes without having to bid them away from alternative uses, and therefore prices not going up, right? When an Austrian might say, well, hold the phone there, right? Depends what you're making, and depends what that human capital structure looks like. It depends what those machines look like. It could well be that you are going to have to bid them away from alternative uses, right, depending on what you're doing. And it may be that the things you need are already employed to make the things that it is that people want. So I don't have a good answer. I'm particularly frustrated by it because I just finished writing this sort of research policy paper for Mercatus exactly on this topic. And the pushback is, well, why, Steve, why are you so worried about inflation? Look at tips, right? I said, yeah, but, look at that hockey stick, right? Because that's like Jason with the mask, coming after you. So yeah, that's a great question. All the way back.
Quick question, just because so many people here are students. You earlier were talking about how you and Brian haven't financed.
I don't know if Brian has, but I meant that I put my money where my mouth is, like Brian says I'm supposed to.
And just taking this, learning and practical way, applying it. I'm not asking you to make any kind of financial recommendations.
Good, because.
But there's a lot of people in here who probably have a fair amount of student loan
Yeah.
debt. Is there anything that you know of that regarding that, or regarding where that might go, or historically how that is treated?
If you've got student debt and you're locked in at what it's 6.8 or whatever it is, which is the running, my son's in college, so I know all this. Whatever it is, if you're locked in, good for you. Because if there's inflation, look, debtors gain from inflation. That's rule number one, right? Because assuming fixed rates, right? Because you're paying back in cheaper dollars than you borrowed, right? So if you've got student loan debt and it's locked in, to that degree, inflation will help you personally. The same way, look, the inflation of the 70s was great for homeowners at the time because there were no adjustable rate mortgages. Everybody was locked in at 5% or whatever. You get the high inflation, you're paying back this mortgage with progressively cheaper dollars. You're seeing your nominal wages rise, but the fixed mortgage payment stays. So anytime you've got fixed interest rate debt, you get inflation, you as the debtor will benefit. Of course, the creditor's losing, right? I mean, there's got to do double entry bookkeeping here. So the concern there would be who's the creditor here? It's Citibank, not anymore, right? Starting this year, it's all the federal government basically, right? So that's all we need there. So yeah, I think that's a good thing. The other, I did a talk for my university a few years ago to graduating seniors, and it was called it's like something like not making financial mistakes or something like that. And one piece of advice I'll give all the college students here, and it's the best financial thing you can do, always pay your bills on time. Period, end of sentence. If you do that, you will acquire a credit rating, a good credit score, you will get apartments, you will get other credit cards, right? I can't remember the last time I paid interest on a credit card, with one exception, because people throw these zero interest rate deals at me all the time. Give it to us for a year. You pay the transaction fee, but you don't pay interest, right? Because I have a good credit rating, because I pay my bills on time every month, whenever they're due. Seriously, people tell, oh, invest in this, invest in that. Pay your bills on time every month. it's not only good financial advice, it's good human advice. It makes, you establish a reputation as a reliable, dependable person, and that in turn affects your credit rating. So that's my brilliant financial advice. Pay your bills on time. Yeah.
Gold is a traditional hedge against inflation. Is it possible that gold is in a bubble?
Yes, and that goes to the tips question. I should have responded to that to the tips question. Because the price of gold is, I think I saw hit a 3-week high yesterday or this morning even maybe. So yeah, and the traditional interpretation is that when inflationary expectations are high, people buy gold. And so the gold at 1,200 or whatever it is right now is a reflection of concerns about inflation. And that would be counter evidence to tips, right? That's the one piece of counter evidence, I think, to the low inflation in tips is that, look, gold. Is it a bubble? I don't see any reason to think that it's a bubble. I just think that there's a group of people who are, gold bugs is unfair, but who are gold investors who look at the data, who are likely to look at the hockey stick data and say, "Oh my God!" Right? And, Jason in the mess, right? So I think that's being driven up by folks who traditionally would like to use gold as a hedge, and they're just really, really scared right now. I don't think that's a bubble in the sense of, to me, a bubble is when that goes up without any plausible explanation or not related to fundamentals. And I think it's not out of their interpretation of the data is not out of the question. And so the fact that people are buying up gold and pushing up that price reflects their expectations. It's a great example, right, of how markets work. We have dueling expectations at work right now. We got some people expecting inflation, and if they're right, all those gold folks are going to do well. If they're wrong, they'll learn next time maybe, right? And conversely, anyone who's betting against inflation, let's say you're buying, futures off tips or something like that, right? You're going to go the other way. So people have real money on the line here, and there's incentive to get it right. I just think we're, again, in uncharted waters, and people just don't know what to do. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Go in back.
So you mentioned specific costs, costs and hidden costs.
Yeah.
It seems like those are arguing in favor of price level stability, not necessarily productivity.
Yeah.
Do you argue the contrary?
No, there's no doubt. The question was, are the costs of changing prices and the sort of accounting costs, are those an argument against the productivity norm? And what's behind that is wouldn't it be better if prices were just stable as opposed to that would solve those problems? Because if we see slowly declining prices, right, we have to engage in menu cost. I think the menu cost answer is the easier one, which is look, the costs involved in remarking prices because people can produce things more cheaply are worth it, right? Those are a cost of efficiency, which is great. And I do think, by the way, that in a computer age, menu costs are much lower than they used to be. So the fact that firms mark down their prices when they can produce things more efficiently and cheaply, I don't worry about. It's such a small cost for such a large gain. And alternatively, that the cost of trying to maintain price level stability means permanent inflation in a productive economy. The trade-off there is a no-brainer for me, which is go with the productivity norm, even though it maybe means you're remarking prices. But even in a price level stability situation, you still have individual firms that would be improving their productivity and having to remark prices. But why pay the toll of inflation just to stabilize the aggregate P, which is meaningless anyway? As far as accountancy issue goes, yeah, I think you have the same questions there. But historically, like in the U.S. in the late 19th century, when we had about as close to the monetary equilibrium productivity norm as we've ever seen, we saw prices decline by like 1% a year, 2%. It wasn't like it was a big decline. It wasn't a big amount. And again, trying to offset that by excess supplies of money would create way more cost than it would ever than the mild amount of distortion you would get from whatever errors accountants make. And even then, right, the whole point is that you're seeing declining input costs and all those sorts of things. So I just think the bottom line is that those costs in the real world where the productivity norm and falling prices are the norm, those costs are so small that the costs of trying to maintain price level stability are much greater because you end up with these things. Okay. I think it's lunchtime. Thanks.